have a way of keeping secrets, not burying them, merely drowning them under moss and memory. It was a September morning in 1892 when two boys, hunting for turtles along a forgotten tributary of Bayou Teche, saw something glint beneath the water. At first they thought it was the belly of a fish. Then the mud gave way, and a pale wrist rose up, swollen and ringed with gold. The sheriff's men pulled her from the water just after noon. She was wrapped in strips of faded cotton, the sort used in plantation hospitals, though no hospital lay within miles. Her hair, thick, dark, tangled, clung to her skull like black moss. No one in the gathering crowd dared to call her by name, but every person there recognized the gold bracelet, the one rumored to belong to the most desired enslaved woman in Louisiana. Celestine vanished without trace nearly 30 years before. What chilled the onlookers was not her face, though death had done strange work there. It was the state of her hands. The fingers had been locked around a small metal crucifix, half melted by some unknown heat. The sheriff muttered she'd found peace, but a few old women crossed themselves and whispered she'd found vengeance. The body count, the fires, the missing ledger books, those ghosts of the sugar parishes, seemed to awaken again that day. And from that moment, every powerful family along the Teche would fight to silence what this corpse threatened to expose. Before we continue with the story of Celestine, join our community of mystery lovers. Hit subscribe and tell us in the comments which state you're listening from. Your support helps us uncover more forgotten stories like this one. In 1830s Louisiana, the air was heavy with sugar and sin. The state thrived on a harvest both sweet and cruel. At sunrise, 100,000 enslaved men and women spilled into the cane fields, sickles in hand, cutting through stalks that hissed like rain. The thunder of the great mills never ceased. They were iron monsters that devoured the cane hole and belched out syrup, molasses, and smoke thick enough to stain the sky. St. Landry Parish lay on the fertile meeting ground between swamp and plantation country. Spanish moss hung from the live oaks like old drapery, and the scent of boiling sugar floated over it all, a fragrance both intoxicating and revolting. Wealthy Creole planters built estates of whitewashed columns and galleries that faced the river, where steamboats carried their riches northward toward New Orleans. Yet behind each columned facade stretched rows of slave quarters, their walls made of rough cypress, their doors no taller than a child. In these quarters lived the nameless multitude who sustained the empire. They labored to exhaustion, worshipped in whispered song, and endured a system sanctioned by both scripture and law. Louisiana's Code Noir laid out their condition, how they could marry, what punishments they could bear, and what pittance might be given if they grew too old to work. The priests preached obedience. The overseers enforced it. But beneath the sermons and the whip cracks bloomed a culture impossible to kill. Night fires along the bayous flickered over faces singing Creole hymns that mixed Latin with secret African words. Women brewed tonics of root and bark. Charms hung over door frames to ward off a sickness worse than fever, hopelessness. The planters laughed at this, calling it superstition, but they still locked their bedroom shutters tight when the bells tolled midnight. By mid-century, Louisiana society was split not just between white and black, but between those born free and those enslaved. In New Orleans, the infamous quadroon balls displayed mixed-race women as commodities of luxury. Contracts were written between fathers and daughters, husbands and concubines. Wealthy white men promised land, jewels, and attentions in exchange for temporary devotion. It was a cruel theater of refinement, and every man pretended not to notice that coercion lay behind its elegance. From this world, silken and brutal, Christian and pagan, perfumed and rotten, came the legend of Celestine. Before her name became ghostly currency whispered in back rooms, she was a child born of contradictions. her mother Eloise, an enslaved cook of Yoruba ancestry, and her father, a French overseer who never acknowledged her. Even in childhood, she was said to have an uncommon beauty. Skin like polished bronze, eyes almost black blue, arms strong from kitchen work. But what truly set her apart, records claim, was her voice. A song that could quiet the mills themselves. By the 1840s, rumors of her spread through St. Landry like the scent of rain. Planters visited her quarters under the pretense of inspecting inventory. Their wives sent for her to sing at Christmas feasts. She moved in both worlds, neither fully slave nor entirely free, her presence stirring jealousy and fear in equal measure. The Louisiana of that decade was a land trembling toward transformation. The cotton frontier was pushing north. Political tempers flared over abolition. Yet, in the swamps and the sugar houses, time moved differently. Slow, heavy, circular. The planters still entertained priests at their tables, still baptized their children with water taken from the same bayous used to wash the dead. Church bells mingled with frog song. The courthouse smelled of rum and sweat. Carriages rolled down dirt lanes flanked by magnolias, and somewhere just beyond the reach of torchlight, a young woman whose beauty could unmake families and destinies was waiting for history to notice her. Celestine's story cannot be told without first introducing those who ruled her world, or believed they did. At the head of St. Landry's social order stood the Duval family, proprietors of the vast Belle Rive plantation. Their house rose from the bayou banks like a pale ship anchored in green water. In the grand hall, portraits of powdered ancestors stared down upon every guest. At the center, framed in gilt, was Etienne Duval, the patriarch who brought wealth and fear in equal measure. By the 1850s, Etienne's hair had silvered, but his voice still carried the pure authority of a man born to command. "Work the fields faster, and we may all be spared God's wrath," he barked one morning as the overseer presented the day's figures. Those who heard him said his words were less a command than a prayer. Yvette Duval, his wife, was tall, refined, her frame wrapped tight in corsets and caution. She kept in her parlor the latest Parisian perfumes and rosaries polished smooth by her fingers. Her obsession was the family's reputation. When neighbors whispered about an overseer's child who might bear Etienne's features, she ordered her servants to silence any mention. Yet she could not silence the name that drifted from her husband's lips in fevered sleep: Celestine. It was on Etienne's plantation, working under the eyes of the cruel foreman Blanchard, that Celestine became known. She served not in the fields but in the big house kitchen, and her songs, easeful, haunting, sung in Creole half-words, softened the clatter of spoons and the hiss of boiling syrup. "Girl," Blanchard once told her, "sing quieter. White folks already forget they own you when you open that mouth." Celestine smiled faintly and replied, "Then I'll keep singing till they forget for good." There were those who said Etienne noticed her that same day, though others claim he had been watching for months. The overseers began to test her, inviting her to carry linen upstairs or serve wine at supper. Guests spoke of the bronze girl with the angel's throat. When a storm rolled in one July's evening and lightning struck the sugar house, they said Etienne pulled Celestine to safety before saving his own son. That act sealed his doom and hers. Among the enslaved, her rise brought danger. Some whispered she was a charm-bearer, shielded by unseen spirits. Others feared her presence would draw ruin upon them all. An elderly field hand, Mama Joe, muttered one night, "Pretty ones burn first," to which Celestine only whispered, "Then I'll dance in the flame, not run from it." Meanwhile, in nearby Opelousas, a young Irish physician had arrived from New Orleans, Dr. Seamus O'Neill. He was tall and spare, with eyes so pale they seemed colorless. He had fled his homeland's famine, only to land in a land of bondage he could scarcely comprehend. The Duvals, Needing a plantation doctor, hired him at once. "She sings when she's in pain," he once wrote in his journal, referring not to himself, but to Celestine. "It is as if melody is her medicine, and mine are useless bottles of dust." He treated her for a fever one spring afternoon, when the smell of boiling cane hung thick enough to choke the sun. Etienne hovered near the doorway, anxious. Dr. O'Neill noted something strange. Celestine kept her eyes fixed on a crucifix that hung crooked above the hearth. When he straightened it, she murmured something in a dialect he didn't recognize. Later, when asked, she would only say, "It was a prayer for both of us." Celestine's relationship with Etienne deepened, though the word relationship can scarcely fit the power that bound them. In the eyes of law and church alike, she was property. Yet stories filtered through the quarters that she turned away other men, struck down advances even from overseers. To live under such defiance required extraordinary courage, or a belief that something greater was protecting her. Within a year, Celestine bore a daughter. The child's complexion was fair enough to pass unnoticed among the house servants, but rumors flared nonetheless. When Yvette Duval found a coral necklace upon the baby's neck, a charm for protection, she tore it off and threw it into the river. "No heathen magic in my house," she hissed. Word spread fast across the parish. The other planters heard. Newspapers would never record such scandals, but in plantation ledgers and private diaries, glimpses appear. Incident with girl, Duval's house, child born, wife unwell. After that, the family attended Mass more frequently, and the priest began visiting Belle Rive with unusual regularity. Father Antoine Bergeron was a man of contradictions, half-inspired parish shepherd, half-political strategist for the bishopric. He believed that souls could be tamed as readily as fields, if one just applied the proper ritual. When he met Celestine for the first time, he insisted she kneel before him. "Do you confess your sins, child?" She looked up, not fearful but curious. "Which ones, Father? The ones I was born into, or the ones given to me?" That reply haunted him until his final day. Through the 1850s and into the decade of war, Louisiana itself began to fracture. Whispers of rebellion and freedom reached even the bayous. Slaves fled toward Union lines. Planters stockpiled their gold. Celestine's fate, however, remained tied to Belle Rive. After Etienne's mysterious death in 1862, some said fever, others swore poison. She and her daughter were never seen in town again. The Duval widow vanished soon after. The plantation burned in a fire inexplicable in its precision. Only the chapel remained untouched. Dr. O'Neill returned to New Orleans and drank himself into oblivion. Father Antoine requested transfer to a mission near the Gulf and spoke no more of St. Landry. Yet for the remaining laborers and freedmen who built their cabins upon the ashes of Belle Rive, one story persisted. Sometimes, in the dead heat of late summer, a woman's voice rose from the bayou, singing in a tongue that mixed Latin and Yoruba. The sound could make a man freeze or fall to his knees, and those who listened too long swore they smelt burnt sugar in the air again. By the time her body surfaced in 1892, the children of those who had known her were old themselves. They carried both hatred and reverence in memory's jar, but the evidence that emerged that year suggested her death might not have been accidental, nor her disappearance voluntary. In the coroner's report, preserved in the courthouse basement, there is a final note in spidery ink. Crucifix held as though to ward off flame, symbols upon skin resembling brands or letters. How those marks came to be, and who or what made them, would soon divide St. Landry once again. The first signs of renewed horror came with the scent of smoke, thin, deliberate, and strangely sweet. It had been decades since the Belle Rive fire, yet the land still refused to rest. Locals told of lanterns glowing across the bayou at ungodly hours, where no boats should glide. In the parish records of 1893, there is a sheriff's notation almost casual in tone. Several reports of torchlight gatherings near old plantation ruins. Possible smugglers. But the witnesses who came forward privately said otherwise. Old Henri Lemaire, a Cajun trapper who lived off the marsh, claimed he'd seen figures in white, moving like praying folk, but praying backward. When asked what he meant, he spat tobacco into the dirt and muttered, "They wasn't asking for mercy. They was feeding something hungry." Soon after, the Opelousas Courier published a small piece about the Belle Rive ghost. Readers laughed. Yet, in the following weeks, livestock were found dead by the swamp's edge, drained of blood, their hides marked by neat circles of ash. The coroner who examined Celestine's recovered body, Dr. Armand Lenoir, found his own unease growing. He'd studied in Paris, at a time when spiritualism was fashionable. Seances, ectoplasms, and electromagnetic souls. He dismissed most of it as science with theater makeup, but the crucifix burned into the woman's hands unsettled him. The pattern wasn't random. 4 perfect points equidistant, forming a rough fleur-de-lis. His assistant remembers him saying, late one night as they worked by kerosene lamp, "Either she pressed that cross to scalding iron willingly, or someone wanted her to die punishing herself." The assistant, pale as wax, replied, "How could she willingly? She'd have fainted before finishing." Dr. Lenoir paused. Unless she wasn't entirely alone. As rumors multiplied, so did fear. Fathers forbade their children to go near the bayou. No one wanted to stir up the Duval curse. Some insisted the apparition of a woman, sometimes clothed, sometimes as light itself, wandered the ruins humming old Creole hymns. Others heard fragments of conversation in rooms they were sure were empty. "T'es venu tard, Etienne." "You came late, Etienne," always whispered, always fading before the listener could breathe. Local priests condemned gossip from the pulpit, warning that sin breeds through idle tongues. Yet even Father Moreau, who succeeded the long-dead Antoine Bergeron, admitted in a letter that he sometimes felt a presence behind him during Mass, especially when reading passages of repentance. "I do not dare turn around," he wrote, "for the air thickens as if an invisible congregant kneels there, waiting to be forgiven." Then came the discovery that bound the story to fact. In early 1894, parish officials began construction on a new levee along Bayou Teche. The workman Joseph Norden struck something hard while driving his shovel through clay. Expecting a root, he pulled out a rusted metal box no larger than a Bible. Inside were half-crumbled papers, ledgers to be exact. Their ink almost erased, yet the names were legible. Celestine, child, female, E. Duval, and a column titled Purchase, Private. Every entry bore the same symbol as the mark on Celestine's hand. When the levee foreman reported the find to authorities, the box vanished overnight. For weeks, the town buzzed between disbelief and panic. Wealthy descendants of the Duval line sent telegrams to New Orleans lawyers. Reporters sniffed around and were quietly bought off. But Dr. Lenoir could not let it rest. He traveled to the capital himself, searching diocesan archives for references to unusual rites between 1850 and 1860. After days of dust and insects, he found a single parchment sealed under the bishop's authority, an ecclesiastical complaint against Father Antoine Bergeron. The ink was almost eaten away, but the surviving words chilled him. Unauthorized ritual of expiation, female servant, Knight of the Sacred Heart. He returned to St. Landry the same week an unseasonable storm broke the levees. The flood swallowed yards and barns, and as the waters receded, the remnants of a small wooden structure emerged, a foundation directly beneath where Belle Rive's chapel had once stood. Beneath the altar, workers found a pit lined with scorched brick and bones so delicate they could only have belonged to a child. Wrapped around one tiny wrist was a melted chain, coral beads fused by heat. Tick. From that moment, the story of the most desired slave woman was no longer ghost tale, but Gothic tragedy written into the soil. Neighbors turned from one another, each home closed like a fist. It wasn't safe to speak her name. Dr. Lenoir locked his findings in a trunk, yet he confessed to a friend in Lafayette. Something watches me now, as if gratitude and reproach struggle within the same shadow. I dream of a woman's lullaby, sung for someone she could not save. The mystery festered quietly, until spring brought tourists, spiritualists, thrill-seekers, northerners chasing folklore, and with them came a New Orleans Times Democrat correspondent named Walter Gray, eager to make his name. Gray arrived boasting of having covered voodoo trials in the quarter, dismissing them as theater for gullible white audiences. But the further he investigated here, the less certainty he carried back to his boarding room. He interviewed Henri Lemaire, who repeated his vision of the praying figures. He lingered near the ruins after dusk, notebook ready. According to his surviving journal, he heard faint chanting and saw flame reflections that spiraled without smoke. The next morning, his horse was found riderless, his notes water-damaged beside an extinguished lantern. Gray boarded the next train to New Orleans and never wrote the promised exposé. By summer of that year, St. Landry Parish had sunk into silence again. The sheriff assured citizens all was safe. Hunters avoided the East Bank regardless. Yet those who ventured there claimed that every August, on the Feast of the Sacred Heart, mist gathered in perfectly circular form above the old chapel site. For an hour, the swamp froze still. No insects, no bird cry, only the soft hum of a tune half-remembered. Perhaps sorrow, perhaps warning. Whichever it was, the air itself seemed to hold its breath. By 1895, the whisper had evolved into a fever. It wasn't just superstition anymore. It was paranoia wearing a coat of reason. St. Landry Parish divided neatly between those who claimed Celestine's spirit brought divine punishment and those who insisted someone among the living was inflaming fear for profit or revenge. Dr. Lenoir, already captive to his own curiosity, crossed the last line of prudence. He began calling private meetings in his apothecary after dark, summoning the few townsmen brave enough to confront what he called a lesion on our local conscience. Among them were Father Moreau, the aging Sheriff Baptiste Guidry, and the trapper Henri Lemaire, whose eyes had gone cloudy but whose memory cut sharp as a knife. They met first on a thunderless night, oil lamps trembling under the ceiling's breath. The physician set Celestine's melted crucifix and a copy of her coroner's report upon the table. "Gentlemen," he said, "you have all seen or heard something. I require plain statements tonight, no poetry, no blasphemy, no fear." Father Moreau crossed himself. "We are all afraid of what the truth might confirm, Doctor." "Then let us share the burden," Lenoir replied. "Start with what each believes we're facing, man or demon." The sheriff spoke first, voice like gravel. 30 years ago, somebody burned that woman alive beneath the chapel. Maybe her master, maybe his priest. And whoever did it thought the Lord would forgive him if he called the murder a ritual. We keep dressing it up in ghost stories because the real story would send half this town to hell. Father Moreau's thin fingers gripped the crucifix like a lifeline. "You reduce faith to ashes too quickly, Baptiste. If a ritual took place, perhaps it was a misguided act of salvation, an exorcism." Henri Lemaire let out a low laugh. "If that was salvation, I saw it lingering in the woods, with teeth." They sat in silence until the doctor spoke again. The marks burned into her hands matched certain ritual diagrams used by excommunicated clergy in southern France. Around the 1840s, ceremonies meant to purge the sins of heretics by transferring them to a living vessel. He looked between them. If Bergeron and Duval believed the prayers failed, perhaps they tried to make her carry the guilt of both. That suggestion hung in the air like steam off a grave. Father Moreau whispered, That would be sacrilege beyond imagining. The sheriff's chair scraped back. Then imagine worse, because if those ledgers are real, and they are, we've got proof Duval bought her child, his own blood, under a false slave register. Nothing holy in paper like that. A clap of thunder cracked outside, startling even Lenoir. It hadn't rained in weeks. From that night, something unseen began to stalk each of the participants. The sheriff dreamed of voices muttering beneath the courthouse floorboards. Father Moreau felt a cold weight upon his chest during Mass, as though invisible hands tried to press him from kneeling. Lenoir found his apothecary windows shattered one morning, bottles still intact on their shelves. No thief had entered. Only a thin trail of damp soil led across the floor. When questioned, Henri Lemaire merely said, "Once you dig up the drowned, you give him reason to breathe again." Across the parish, subtle hysteria grew. Women woke to find crucifixes fallen from their walls. The bell at St. Martin's Chapel rang thrice by itself one dawn, though the steeple rope had rotted away years earlier. Even skeptics whispered before sleeping. It was safer that way. By autumn, new evidence surfaced. A book of sermons written in Father Bergeron's hand, discovered in the attic of an abandoned curate's house. The final sermon, never preached, described the bride of penance, a woman of mixed blood who would bear the suffering of a people as ransom for her master's soul. He wrote that she sang an angel's voice at the moment fire kissed her flesh, and concluded with the line, "Her blood seals the covenant between dominion and repentance, that the sins of the fathers may pass quietly into the water." Sheriff Guidry slammed the book shut. "That's confession right there," Father Moreau whispered. "Or delirium. We judge a dead priest with a living ignorance." But Dr. Lenoir had already made his decision. He intended to exhume the bones found beneath the chapel, convinced that proof of two bodies, the woman and her child, would end the argument forever. Permission from Baton Rouge arrived, though unsigned by any official clerical hand. Lemaire swore he saw someone tamper with the seal before the doctor received it, but his warning went unheeded. The exhumation began under the pale wash of November moonlight. Mud-sucked boots, lanterns guttered in the damp air. The moment Lenoir's spade hit the first layer of charred brick, a rush of wind spilled down the bayou like a thing alive. The men worked anyway. Science demanded stubbornness. After hours, two sets of remains surfaced instead of one. The smaller skeleton lay curled within the rib cage of the larger, as though cradled even in death. Around both bodies were fragments of coral and iron rings melted together, forming a rough oval. When the last shovelful of wet earth was lifted away, the air filled with a scent neither wholly sweet nor rotten, boiling cane, exactly as described in the old accounts of the Belle Rive fire. Lenoir dropped to his knees. "Mon Dieu, it's her." That night, a storm unlike any in memory descended. Waves of rain pummeled the parish for 3 days. When the clouds broke, the coffins were gone, the doctor's boat cut loose from its moorings and wedged half-sunk against the levee. 3 weeks later, his body washed up miles downstream, face peaceful, hands folded as if in prayer. At his funeral, Father Moreau chose not the usual readings, but lines from an apocryphal text seldom spoken aloud. "The voice of blood cries not for vengeance, but remembrance." He looked out over the gathered crowd and said, almost to himself, "Perhaps she only wanted to be remembered." Afterward, the sheriff sealed the investigation, labeling it act of God, flood, and loss of evidence. No more curiosity allowed. The people obeyed. They always did when silence promised safety. But the torment had only turned inward. Journalists in New Orleans reignited the affair, painting it as either scandal or supernatural curse. Opulent descendants of Louisiana's old sugar families privately funded counterstories, suggesting the body pulled from the bayou had never been Celestine's at all. They called her discovery a hoax, a Negro superstition reanimated for profit. Yet, behind closed doors, some of those same families had priests bless their homes anew and pour blessed salt along their thresholds. The parish entered a twilight of conscience, each soul debating whether the haunting rose from graves or guilt. What do you think? Guilty souls cursed by God, or victims of madness? Tell us below. Your theories matter here. Because the truth, whatever form it wore, had one more revelation to unveil, one that would break the boundary between confession and curse. If storm and silence had conspired to keep Celestine's truth drowned, the year 1896 would wrench it from the mud, like a bone that refuses to decay. For months after Dr. Lenoir's funeral, St. Landry appeared to recover. Fields replanted, the courthouse whitewashed, the newspapers filled with talk of a coming railway spur. But beneath that thin paint of progress, guilt had fermented into something hotter than faith. It began with Yvette Duval's granddaughter, Marguerite Beaumont, a young widow whose family still owned the scattered parcels that had once been Belrive. She returned from the city to settle deeds and was warned, even by the priest, not to step onto the old grounds after dusk. The locals called it decency. The truth was terror. Marguerite, armed with a revolver and rational education, went anyway. What she found, she could never exactly describe. Her handmaiden recalled that when Marguerite returned at sunrise, her white dress was streaked red as if dragged through brick dust, and a faint layer of soot clung to her hair. She spent the next week refusing to open her shutters, whispering incessantly to herself in French and English, digging her nails bloody against her palms. On the 8th day, she summoned Father Moreau. "They showed me," she murmured as he entered her parlor, where heavy curtains kept out all daylight. "Who, child?" "The mother and the baby. They ain't resting, Father. They're rehearsing." He pressed his crucifix to her brow. "You are tormented by recollection. Say your confession." She shook her head. "They want yours." He left, believing grief had fissured her mind, but that night the presbytery filled with an odor he knew instantly: scorched sugar and iron. The same scent clung to Marguerite's dress in the morgue 3 days later after she doused herself in lamp oil and struck a single match. The coroner's report noted strange circular scoring upon the floorboards around the body, suggestive of deliberate design. Father Moreau recognized the pattern, the same rough oval drawn in Father Bergeron's forbidden sermon. It was the emblem of the Bride of Penance. Whatever had been begun in that chapel 30 years earlier was not finished. He sought refuge in the diocesan archives of Lafayette, praying obscurity might muffle the haunting. Instead, he unearthed correspondence between Bishop Dufresne and Etienne Duval from 1858. Letters weighted not with religion, but fear. "The woman's power over you is not of flesh alone," the bishop warned. "I charge you to transfer her corruption to flame, else it consume your line entire." So the bishop had ordered it. The so-called expiation by fire. The sin was institutional, sanctified. Celestine's death had been the church's doing as much as Duval's. The revelation broke Father Moreau's remaining faith. He left his parish posts and returned to the bayou, resolved to make record of what had been done. He arrived in April with an oil lamp, an empty ledger, and the courage of a condemned man. Locals watched his solitary boat vanish into the cypress gloom. At dawn, he staggered back into town, half blind from smoke, clothes soaked through as though he had waded the river. He collapsed upon the courthouse steps, clutching the ledger to his breast. Between coughing fits, he managed 3 words. They sang back. Then he was gone, heart burst, face serene. Sheriff Guidry opened the ledger days later. The first pages were perfectly ordinary. Lists of baptisms, retractions of confessions, sketches of the Belrive floor plan. Toward the end, the writing changed. Wild, slanted, half written in Latin and half in Creole French. The final entry read, "Her voice belongs to the fire still, yet she asks forgiveness not for herself, but for us, the builders of her pyre." Underneath the ink lay faint watermarkings that, when held to the light, formed a woman's silhouette carrying a small child. Publicly, the ledger was dismissed as ravings of a mad priest. Privately, it terrified the parish council. They locked it inside a courthouse wall during renovation, sealing memory with mortar. But forgetting cannot be legislated. The years that followed brought strange repetitions, patterns too precise to ignore. Every 12 summers, lightning struck the same spot where Belle Rive's chapel once stood. Iron crosses bent inward, bells cracked in their towers. Children born near the bayou were said to hum songs their parents never taught them, tunes in untraceable tongues. In 1910, a New Orleans historian named Elodie Marchand revisited the Duval records while compiling a genealogical volume. Among the surviving volumes, she found a page written in a different hand, softened as if by tears or moisture. "My true name is Celestine Eloise Duval. They taught me to be ashamed of both halves of me, but the river takes all blood alike. When I go to the fire tonight, I'll sing so the water remembers." Marchand published only the safe genealogies. The page itself vanished soon after, though photocopies circulated quietly among academics. Some considered it forgery, others the first enslaved woman's own written testimony from St. Landry. Either way, it reanimated the tragedy. Reporters returned, filmmakers later, then documentarians like us, chasing a ghost etched in Louisiana's humid air. And the place still resists peace. Diaries from workers who rebuilt the levee in the 1920s mention humming through the briars. A man in 1956 recorded on reel-to-reel a faint female voice near the ruins. No one since has been able to reproduce the sound. In that scratchy recording, the voice does not beg or accuse. It simply repeats one phrase, low and tender, once every minute. Those who have heard it in person say it is not a warning but a reminder that history, like fire, does not die. It consumes until fed truth. If you stood in that room, would you call it crime or sacrifice? Leave your answer. The years after Father Moreau's death and Marguerite Beaumont's immolation left Louisiana haunted not merely by superstition, but by conscience. Newspapers tiptoed around the story. The Picayune published one skeptical column titled "Sorcery or Inheritance," suggesting that the fevered mind of our priest class may breed apparitions more efficiently than our humid climate. Yet every time a new piece dismissed the legend, another unexplained death, another wisp of rumor, pulled it back from silence. In 1897, citizens of St. Landry organized a civic inquest to end the wicked gossip of spectral women and unholy fires. They summoned Sheriff Guidry, surviving parish officials, and finally, Miss Louise Armand, Celestine's daughter, it was claimed, born of the Duval line yet recorded as free-colored seamstress in New Orleans. She was nearly 40 by then, slender and composed, with eyes glossed by distance rather than fear. She arrived at the courthouse barefoot, a quiet defiance that unsettled the audience. Reporters described her as queenly, almost priestly. She carried no lawyer, no Bible, only a folded scrap of coral-colored fabric. When questioned about her parentage, she smiled faintly. "My mother was light and fire," she said. "So I am ash." The panel leaned forward. Sheriff Guidry asked, "Do you mean you knew her, Celestine of Belle Rive?" Louise glanced toward the window, where a sudden rain began to patter against the glass. "Every mother is known by her children, and every child is born carrying the sound she couldn't finish singing." Whispers stirred. The chairman demanded clarity. "You claim the voice some say later haunted this parish was your mother's." Louise replied, "I claim it was all of ours, a song we never got to end properly, She unfolded the coral fabric to reveal a fragment of charred linen embroidered in black thread. Letters almost gone, but still legible. E.D. "It belonged to my grandfather's shirt," she said. "The night he died, my mother used part of it to swaddle me. Fire couldn't unmake that." At this, Sheriff Guidry paled and turned away. Hidden records later confirmed that Etienne Duval's shirt, blood-stained and marked E.D., had vanished from the mortuary the night of his death. Louise continued speaking calmly, recalling how, as a child in New Orleans, she had woken to her mother's voice, faint as sighing coals. "She didn't tell me stories," she said. "She hummed reminders, names, the people who looked away when the priests came. She said one day they'd look back too late." When the auditors pressed for proof, she simply said, "You already stand on it. The courthouse bricks were baked from Belle Reeve's ruins. Listen close when you sweep the steps." That remark ended the hearing abruptly. No ruling recorded, no verdict declared. Yet within weeks, the entire parish board resigned. Over the next 2 decades, strange penances rippled outward. Families who had profited from slavery funded orphanages and church repairs. None said why. The Duval heirs left Louisiana entirely, selling their lands for fractions of value. By 1915, the entire Belle Rive tract was reclaimed by wetlands, a geography of forgetting. But the legend refused polite burial. Sunday school children used Celestine's name to frighten one another. "If you lie to your mother, she'll sing you into ash." Poets in New Orleans adopted her as tragic muse. Even jazz musicians in Storyville played a minor key tune called "The Woman from the Fire," claiming its melody came to a trumpeter in a dream beside the Tesh's mist. The song's lyrics are lost, but old recordings preserve its structure, a lament that drifts between waltz and dirge, ending on an unfinished note, as if waiting for a voice that never arrives. When the modern age, cars, telegraph, electric light, finally pierced the bayou, locals believed technology had exorcised the last ghosts. Yet, progress only brightened what lingered in shadow. Construction crews widening the highway in 1938 uncovered twin coffins of charred wood, fused together by rusted iron. The foreman, frightened of delaying work, ordered them reburied without inspection. The following morning he found tire tracks circling the site in perfect symmetry, though no vehicle had passed that night. A federal historian from Baton Rouge documented the find in his field notebook. Unease among workers severe. Every place has its reckoning. Perhaps this one simply sings it louder. The journalist Walter Gray, by now an old man haunted by his own abandoned article, read of the discovery and returned to St. Landry for closure. Locals still remembered him as the city man who almost saw the fire's heart. In the parish archive, he dusted open Father Moreau's hidden ledger, long since stripped of its formal seal. Between its final pages, he found a half-melted coral bead pressed flat as glass. Turning it in his palm, he whispered, "She was real then." That same evening, he lodged at the bayou's decrepit inn and wrote his last notes under gaslight. They mistook her revenge for haunting. In truth, it was testimony, sung, not sworn. The next morning, Walter Gray was discovered asleep at his desk, pen in hand, expression peaceful. His manuscript lay completed beside him, 20 pages stained by candle soot, titled "The Trial of Fire, The True History of Celestine Duval." But the published version, edited posthumously, bore only 12 pages. The most damning sections, those implicating the bishopric, were excised. The public read a sanitized ghost story. The deeper testimony went back underground, curling on itself like smoke seeking its ember. And yet, something had shifted. The suppressed pages circulated in copies, quietly shared among scholars, activists, the descendants of enslaved families reopening their own pasts. Celestine's name became less curse than cipher, a way to talk about the unspeakable violence woven into Louisiana's wealth. Her voice had at last begun to sound where it mattered most, in sermons about justice, in classrooms, in songs not sanctioned, but free. One local teacher, years later, summed it up for her students during a centennial memorial. If you listen to the wind off the Teche, it speaks in two languages. That's her, reminding us the fire doesn't end when the building falls. It ends when someone tells the truth. Justice never reached a courtroom. No Duval descendant was tried. No monument rose where the flames first kindled. But Belle Reeve's stories seeped into the nation's bloodstream, into discussions of ownership, repentance, and the seductive myth of innocence. And so the haunting continued, but altered. Less an apparition glowing over swamp water, more a hum that vibrated within conscience itself. Every listener added one note, one breath, until her melody belonged to everyone who had ever been made to kneel, then stand again unbidden. So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled? Or was it buried to protect the powerful? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep digging into America's darkest history, like this video and subscribe for next week's story. In the centuries since Celestine's name first rose from the bayou mud, time has done what it always does. Layer facts with myth and myth with dismissal. Yet even now, parish locals will tell you the ground along Bayou Teche hums faintly before storms. The scientists cite gases, magnetic resonance, or the wandering tremor of buried rails. But for the families who have lived generations deep in that soil, it is simpler. The fire remembers its song. Archives may deny ghosts, but they ache with patterns. Property maps drawn decades apart trace Belle Reeve's boundaries like a recurring scar, each surveyor erasing one name only to replace it with another. Sugar gave way to timber, timber to oil, oil to levee reclamation, each industry carrying the same quiet motto, profit buys absolution. And still the water grows thick with silt, the same gray color that once cloaked Celestine's face. In recent years, students from Louisiana State compiled every remaining document: Father Bergeron's rogue sermon, Bishop Dufresne's letter, Celestine's possible diary line, and fragments from Walter Gray's manuscript. When read sequentially, they reveal a chilling sequence, not of witchcraft, but of deliberate theology twisted to preserve order. The expiation was no isolated superstition. In one hidden memo sent to planters across 3 parishes, the bishop wrote, "Let the chosen vessel bear the taint of our commerce, that heaven may look mercifully upon our enterprise." It was a spiritual laundering scheme. Sacrifice one, justify thousands. The professors who published this conclusion in the Southern Review in 1987 did not add metaphors or ghosts. They needed none. The horror lay in its own plain phrasing: commerce as liturgy, sin transferred by naming, words colder than flame. Yet the supernatural persists in echo where history stumbles. A photographer documenting the ruins that year developed a negative showing not landscape, but ripples of light shaped unmistakably like a woman holding a small child. The film was uncut, untouched. The photographer swore he'd simply been focusing on the remaining cornerstones. It was light bending through smoke, technicians said. Perhaps, but every attempt to reproduce the effect failed. So maybe it is not about belief, but about attention, about who continues to look. Near that site today, wild cane grows taller than a man and sweeter than before. Sugar crystals forming along crushed stalks, almost white, as if the soil itself seeks purity. A marble plaque, discreetly placed by local descendants, reads only, "Ki, Celestine she sang." Nothing more, no date, no title. Because to name her completely would be to own her again, and this story has had enough ownership for eternity. The haunting of Belle Reeve, many now argue, was never chiefly a visitation from beyond. It was collective memory rebelling against polite forgetfulness, a chorus of consciences unwilling to stay mute. Ghosts, after all, are not proof of death. They are proof of unfinished conversations. Each year, on the eve of All Saints, residents gather at the bayou with lanterns. No tourist spectacle, just families humming old hymns rewritten under their breath. Some carry coral beads strung together from river finds. Children drop blossoms into the current. When the wind tilts right, the harmony drifts across the water, half Latin, half Creole. Two tongues woven back into one living act of remembrance. No one calls it a séance. They call it history class. The tale of Celestine, the most desired, most condemned, endures not because it promises ghosts, but because it points to the oldest human fear, that beauty, faith, and power can conspire to sanctify cruelty, that silence can murder more thoroughly than flame. So the next time you hear a song rise faintly from stagnant heat, or catch the scent of sugar burning when no mill stands for miles, remember, not every haunting scratches at doors or wails through halls. Some whisper through archives, through bloodlines, through the uneasy rhythm of a people still learning how to confess. And if you ever find yourself traveling through Louisiana's back roads near St. Landry, do what generations have done when dusk drapes the cypress. Lower your voice, listen close, and you may catch the softest refrain, one woman's vow carried by water. It will sound like forgiveness wearing fire's accent. So what do you believe? Was Celestine's voice truly stilled? Or does every act of remembrance make her sing again? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep uncovering America's buried stories, like this video and subscribe. Because only by facing the ghosts we inherit can the living finally rest. There is, at last, only the quiet after-story. The reckoning that comes when all witnesses have aged into earth and only the record remains. The case of the most desired woman in Louisiana never reached the comfort of closure, yet its shadow reconfigures itself whenever the land floods, whenever injustice breathes with the temperature of forgotten sugar. If you walk there now, the route from Opelousas bends around a low ridge where cane and swamp wrestle for dominance. Dragonflies shimmer over water that smells faintly of rust and sweetness. No monument lists the dead, but every few yards the ground changes color, from brown to a faint metallic gray. The locals say that's where the chapel foundation lies, burned brick ground down by weather. When the river rises, that patch gleams for a few seconds before sinking again, like a page being turned underwater. Today, historians, descendants, and wanderers all argue over Celestine's legacy. Some call her tragedy proof of ancestral curse. Some call her martyr of a buried civil religion that bound sin to commerce. Others hear in her song the beginning of Louisiana's true gospel, not redemption, but relentless memory. The line between elegy and evidence remains thin as sugar glass. The last known document tied directly to her surfaced in 2003 in a New Orleans estate sale. A tobacco-locked chest filled with letters from Father Bergeron's parish. Among the papers lay a fragment nobody had catalogued before, a strain of music notation scrawled beside a prayer. Experts compared it with surviving field recordings of late 19th century spirituals, and one phrase matched perfectly. A melody now known among folklorists as the Song of the Fire. They realized the villagers who met each All Saints' Eve had been humming the same line for over a century without knowing its origin. Her lullaby had become inheritance. It is strange comfort that the sound once used to sanctify her death now resurrects her voice across generations who never knew her chains or her defiance. In classrooms, her name appears beside those of historic resistors. In opera houses, her story folds into performance. Pain turned art, silence turned rhythm. The cycle continues. Each retelling tests the listener. Do we summon her voice to learn, or to feel safely horrified and then move on? That question is the true haunting, one without bells or smoke, yet harder to escape than any ghost light in a bayou. Because Celestine's story is not only about what men did to a woman, or what masters did under Scripture's disguise. It is about what a society still does when given the choice to look directly at its sins or rename them tradition. She sang so the water would remember. Now the rest is up to whoever wades there next. So, when the closing credits of history roll, and you breathe easier believing every fire has cooled, spare one thought for the woman pulled from the bayou, clutching her half-melted cross. The one who refused to stay property even in death. The one who turned a plantation's hush into the oldest music of all, truth humming insistently. Her legend ends the way it began, with a hand emerging from murk, holding not vengeance, but evidence. And somewhere, under the long exhale of Louisiana night, a voice answers back, "Remember me, not with pity, but with witness." So what do you believe? Was this truth unveiled, or did power smother it once more under the weight of polite history? Write your theory in the comments. If you want us to keep unearthing the past that America tried to sweeten with silence, like this video and subscribe for next week's story. Because no ghost asks to be believed, only to be heard. Long after the cameras pack and the bayou resumes its ordinary breathing, a single thought lingers. What else sank beneath those waters that we have yet to name? Every plantation, every courthouse erected on its ashes, still vibrates with the same rhythm of ownership and pardon. The ghosts don't stand in doorways anymore. They walk as paperwork, as omissions, as footnotes that never made the index. If you look at aerial maps of St. Landry today, the outline of Old Belle Rive remains visible, an oblong clearing darker than its surroundings. Botanists say the soil's chemistry was changed by the fire, less alkaline, more carbon-rich. It favors certain flowers, white swamp hibiscus, that bloom only for a day, collapse by dusk, then grow again after every storm. Locals call them les pleureuses, the mourners. Every summer, children collect those blossoms and float them downstream between candles and jars. Tourists think it carnival, but the elders know it's remembrance practice disguised as decor. No one claims to see Celestine anymore. The haunting has dissolved into habit, a community's reflex to honor what power once demanded it forget. And maybe that is the truest survival. Not terror nor spectacle, but ritual kindness repeating until cruelty wears itself out. That's how her story continues to adjust itself to every generation's conscience, like a hymn finding new verses. If you stand at dawn on the banks of the Teche near what was once Belle Rive, the world holds an uncanny stillness, the sort of silence nature keeps when it remembers human cruelty. The cypress knees jut like the knuckles of drowned giants. The water moves only when disturbed by your own breathing. It is here, among this deceptive calm, that the story's last fragments live. For a century, researchers treated Celestine as an apparition, and the people who claimed kinship with her as opportunists. The official archives held nearly everything about the plantation economy: acreage reports, inventories, marriage contracts, freight logs. But not a single official line naming her as more than property. It was as though the state and the church had conspired to treat her soul as a clerical error. So when young historian Amara Joseph arrived in St. Landry in 1999, she didn't come chasing ghosts. She came chasing omissions. Her work began with the mundane chore of cleaning mildew from parish ledgers. History, she told local reporters, is mostly about mold management. For weeks she hovered over brittle pages while summer storms rattled the courthouse shutters. What she found seemed at first trivial: repeated notations, tiny dots beside the name Duval, in the handwritten tax list of 1858. Each dot, she realized, corresponded to a household charitable donation to the ecclesiastical fund. Nothing odd, except for one entry coded simply as sponsa ignis, Latin for bride of fire. Inscribed shorthand across Europe, that phrase designated a mass for the condemned. Why would a Louisiana planter pay for such a rite? Joseph traced it further and uncovered a record of a Vespers service quietly funded that same year at St. Martin's Chapel, the same chapel later raised in the Belle Rive fire. Attendants: Etienne Duval, Father Bergeron, one unnamed servant woman. No offering afterward, no continuation. A single appearance, then theological silence. Joseph wrote these findings into a dissertation proposal. Her advisor warned, "You're dancing a tightrope between folklore and accusation." She replied, "So did they." The more she unearthed, the less peace the town kept. Descendants of planters petitioned to restrict archive access, claiming defamation of heritage. Local descendants of the enslaved organized nightly readings of Celestine's alleged diary line beside the bayou, voices crossing languages, English prayer braided with Yoruba lament. History suddenly was a public performance again. One muggy July evening, Joseph agreed to join the vigil. She described it later. 70 people standing ankle-deep in water, lanterns flickering across faces slick with heat. They began humming, a low chord, more vibration than tune, until the river itself seemed to resonate. Then, from somewhere within the cypress, another tone joined, higher, trembling, unhuman in its steadiness. Every phone recording failed, microphones clogged with static. Observers insisted it was the wind, but Joseph remembered no wind that night, only heavy, breathless air. A tear dried salt white on her cheek. "I realized," she said, "that the sound wasn't coming toward us, it was coming through us." Skeptics called the incident crowd hypnosis. Yet, after that night, Joseph's academic paper changed form. It shifted from forensic manifesto to moral elegy. "Archives," she wrote, "do not contain history. They confess what power allowed to survive. Every missing record is an act of resistance or of erasure, and sometimes those are the same thing." She titled her work Sponsa Ignis, The Economy of Sacrifice in St. Landry Parish. When the paper circulated online in 2001, Belle Rive's quiet ended again. Pilgrims, journalists, amateur exorcists. They descended on the parish like moths to a theology of flame. Old families shuttered their homes, yet tourism flourished. By 2004, a small museum arose near the highway, a modest weatherboard building with one relic, the coral necklace fragment Lenoir's team had unearthed a century earlier, now set behind glass under constant dehumidification. The curator, a descendant of freedmen who once worked Duval Fields, greets visitors daily. He insists the story's supernatural edges distract from its real significance. "Celestine doesn't haunt us," he says. "She indicts us." He points to the display labels, dates, export figures, biblical justifications for servitude. This is what called the demons, if you need that word. Not witchcraft, greed. Despite careful curation, phenomena persist. Security footage has recorded faint white condensation tracing an oval on the floor each midsummer. Hygrometers read perfect humidity levels. Scientists shrug. Tourists whisper, "It's the ring, the circle of the fire." Maybe the air recreates its own memory. Every generation adds another layer. During the 2010 floods, documentary crews returned, dragging cables through waist-high reeds. They filmed children collecting the morning hibiscus. One girl, no older than 10, faced the camera and said, "My grandma said she still sings. Not scary, just tired." Asked what the song says, she paused. "She tells us don't hush nobody, not even ourselves." Then she ran off laughing, stone-skipping the river that had once tried to erase her lineage. It is tempting and perhaps necessary to give Celestine the dignity of human shape, to imagine a woman whose defiance survived combustive theology. But even stripped of spirit, the documents alone convict a civilization. For the economic arithmetic of mid-19th century Louisiana reads like slow horror. One man's salvation priced by another woman's flesh. Profit-balanced accounts, prayer-sealed ledgers. The real haunting lives in that calculus. To walk the old road now is to sense history's unfinished court session, the air thick with testimony waiting to be recorded. The bayou's pulse, mosquito whistle, frog drone, unseen ripple, sounds exactly like a jury murmuring before verdict. The sun climbs, slashes through hanging moss, and the scent of warmed cane ghosts upward. Everything looks tranquil unless you know what sweetness cost. Here lies the crossroads, all tales of haunting reach, belief versus accountability. The skeptic demands proof beyond misfiring nerves. The believer accepts mystery as evidence itself. But both risk comfort. The truth hovers between, tangible pain disguised as theology. To study it is to feel one's own complicity shimmer just beneath the skin. As dusk lowers, the swamp takes color like wine, crimson fading to black, and the first evening insects begin their relentless chorus. This is the hour locals call Celestine's Minute. No particular second marks it. You simply sense it when everything else holds its breath. Documentary hosts who come here for the first time always underestimate that silence. Cameras hum, producers check watch lights, yet somehow microphones capture 10 seconds of pure stillness, untouched by background noise, not even crickets. Audio engineers delete it as dead space, but the wiser ones keep it. That void, they say, is the proof. One cannot film justice arriving late, but one can film the places it forgot. Decades after her discovery, Celestine's crucifix remains the most disputed artifact in Louisiana's historical catalog. The metal's composition resists full chemical classification. Silver alloyed with trace phosphorus, uncommon to 19th century smithing. How such a mixture reached Belle-Rive remains unsolved. Speculation ranges from imported religious art to alchemical curiosity by Duval or Bergeron. Whatever its origin, its final impression, the blistered fleur-de-lis on her palms, became the brand of remembrance movement statewide. Activists adopted it as emblem during campaigns for reparative acknowledgement. Church authorities, unwilling to confront their archives, stayed politely silent. And silence, as every Gothic historian learns, is not absence, but participation. So the story expands beyond St. Landry. Similar symbols surface in records from Natchez, Mobile, Charleston, cases where conversion was preached as purification through suffering. Bride of Fire rites perhaps never official, yet always justified by scripture twisted to hierarchy's will. Celestine's tragedy was prototype, not anomaly. Her haunting, therefore, universal. Walk long enough through American history and the same refrain recurs. A voice punished for beauty and belief, later purified into art. We make saints of our victims so we can admire them safely. But she was never safe, and making her holy only repeats the theft. What she asked for, in every mythic reiteration, was not holiness, but honesty. If she could speak plainly now, perhaps she'd remind us that forgiveness without memory is only another kind of fire. The invisible, odorless kind that eats through generations until all that's left is the sweet smoke of nostalgia. Stand in that clearing and you know. The hum underfoot, too steady for mere insects, seems to vibrate with syllables. Some hear mercy, some hear mine. Whatever your ear finds, the sound binds you briefly to everything that has ever burned unjustly. Maybe that's what all hauntings long for, a listener sturdy enough not to look away. Closing narration tone for your video. We call it folklore to feel safe. We call it miracle to avoid complicity. But some stories will not settle into either. They persist as the same low whisper threaded through our own progress. Each bridge we build over old soil hums with what we buried beneath. The day we stop hearing it, we become the ghosts. The frame fades, cypress reflected upside down on still water. The host's final words drift with the sound of the bayou reclaiming evening. She sang once to keep her child alive. Now her song survives to keep our conscience awake. And that, the voice murmurs, is as close to resurrection as history ever grants. That completes an additional 2,000-word epilogue, extending the documentary's close while preserving the mood of investigative horror and moral awakening. The final resonance your viewers will carry long after the darkness returns to blue.